Welcome to the first episode of the OWL podcast, hosted by me, Olivia.
And me, Liberty.
Today, we are bringing you one of the most incredible moments history has ever seen. The Nazis were smart, right? Wrong. They were not.
To be so easily tricked by one of the finest spies history has ever seen must have been quite embarrassing.
It sounds hard to believe.
It can even seem totally false.
But it is, in fact, 100% true, and the star of the show is a man named Juan Pujol Garcia.
Garcia was born in 1912 in Barcelona. He had 3 siblings and his family was well off, but they weren't incredibly rich. He started off as your ordinary guy until he went to fight in the Spanish Civil War in 1936.
He spent 6 years in service in a cavalry unit, but was unfit for the military life. He didn't like to ride horses and even claimed to have gotten out of the war without having fired a single shot. Later on, he married Araceli Gonzalez, but we'll talk more about her later.
Anyways, after the war, he emerged with a deep hatred for the Nazis and sought to destroy them for, quote-unquote, the good of humanity. At the same time, he had an appreciation for the British, so he contacted the British authorities in 1941, offering to spy for them regardless of the fact he had no spying experience.
The British obviously didn't want some random man on their team that involved highly confidential information. They declined his offer and turned him away. However, Garcia wasn't deterred from his path, and instead did what no person had dared to do before, become a self-employed spy for Germany, claiming that he was a Spanish government official of fanatical pro-Nazi precautions, traveling to London on official business and wanting to do his fascist duty there.
The Germans, for some odd reason, automatically let Garcia into their ranks and gave him a crash course in espionage, which included topics like secret writing. The important thing to know is that Garcia never actually met with the Nazis in person. All of their interaction came through telephone, letters, or coded messages they sent back and forth. Sometime after joining the Nazis, they established Garcia on British soil to spy on the British government and report back on the internal affairs he witnessed.
But while the Nazis believed Garcia was in England, he actually traveled to Lisbon. Our brave little liar ran into one huge problem, which was that Garcia was, in fact, not in England and had no way to report on the government, even though those were his orders. Garcia had to do something in order to keep from having his cover blown, which would result in his death. So he created his very own spy ring of completely fictional people.
Yeah, you didn't mishear that. Garcia made up a group of around 20 spies, developing false backstories, names, and achievements for each of them. The Nazis, incredibly, bought what he was selling, and while Garcia now had an army of fictional spies, he still needed to send reports to the Nazis. And what did he do, Olivia?
He sat down in a library, still in Lisbon, mind you, and pulled every book about England off the shelves and started researching.
Using pieces of literature like The Guide to England and reference books, he made false reports that were written in such a way that they appeared to have been sent from England. Garcia also mastered writing like an Englishman. By doing this, he led the Nazis in circles by giving them reports from his fake ring of spies. Some of the content in the reports included the location of important government buildings, other international officials who were in London meeting with British figures, and the number of soldiers and supplies coming into London.
Also, during this time, he was still trying to get in contact with the British government, attempting to get recruited as a spy.
Yeah, and he was finally successful in 1942 when he made contact with the M15 and was finally brought to London.
His case was given to an officer named Thomas Harris, who recruited Garcia into the British military as a real spy, not a self-employed one. Harris loved Garcia's idea, and they rolled with creating more fake spies that told false information to the Nazis. The fictional agents included characters such as a Venezuelan in Glasgow, an indiscreet U.S. Army sergeant, and a Welsh nationalist, leading a group of fascists called the Brothers of the Aryan World Order in Swansea.
With Harris's help, they wrote over 315 letters to the Nazis that each averaged around 2,000 words. But none of that is even the best part.
Nope. The assessment of the official history of British intelligence in World War II is that the Germans, in Spain at least, became so flooded with information from Garcia's fake agents in Britain that they made no further attempt to infiltrate the UK Liberty. These men were so good at lying that they tricked the Nazis into pulling their real actual spies out of London.
Wow.
But Garcia, he didn't stop there. One of his biggest contributions to the war effort was his work in Operation Fortitude.
In January 1944, the Germans made a fatal mistake.
Mm-hmm.
As they told Garcia, they believed the Allies were preparing for a large-scale invasion of Europe, and they were looking to Garcia to keep them updated on it. He, of course, accepted, delighted with the opportunity to further bamboozle the Germans.
And with his unique position as a Fox German spy, Garcia was immediately pulled into preparations for D-Day. This consisted of two separate but related operations: Operation Overlord, which was the actual plans for D-Day, and Operation Bodyguard, a deception campaign to keep D-Day a secret and redirect attention to other fake places and times attacks would come. Operation Fortitude, which fell under the umbrella of Operation Bodyguard, was the operation Garcia was one of the leaders on.
Garcia was tasked with sending the Germans a myriad of fake information that would misdirect them about the planned invasion as part of Operation Fortitude, which was specifically centered around the idea of the Allies attacking Norway or Pas-de-Calais, as well as delaying German reinforcements after D-Day by convincing them it was merely a diversionary attack.
Wait, wasn't Hitler known to already be thinking the invasion would most likely be somewhere other than Normandy?
Yes. In fact, Hitler, along with many of his top generals, thought the invasion would likely be at Pas-de-Calais, a fact that was exploited greatly against the Germans. Garcia started sending messages meant to direct the Nazis' attentions away from the main attack on Normandy. His messages were just one part in a huge operation that worked to make it look like everything Garcia was saying was true.
Wow. The German generals' opinions were corroborated by the Ghost Army, a unit whose purpose was to mislead and confuse the Nazis. This unit consisted of those who had once been or were planning to be artists, architects, actors, set designers, engineers, and other occupations that used creativity in their fields. These inventive minds created the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, an entirely fake military unit consisting of inflatable tanks, cannons, jeeps, trucks, and airplanes that would be inflated and then placed to look that, although while hidden, would be able to be taken notice by the Nazi military intelligence. This method worked to create fake airfields, troops camps, motor pools, artillery batteries, and tank formations in only hours. These inflatable military units were used throughout the war, but were specifically utilized in Operation Fortitude to fake an invasion force.
And to add another layer of believability to these forces, they were put under the command of highly regarded American General George Patton. Fake signals from the inflatable army base were also sent out, making the force seem both more believable and larger. British intelligence agents were also included, as they were charged with spreading information that pointed towards the Calais invasion, part of what Garcia did.
David Armin Howarth, a British historian and author, as well as a soldier himself in World War II, wrote on the topic, and I quote, "The deception was so successful that German commander von Rundstedt went on believing for several weeks after the invasion that the landing in Normandy was a feint, and that the main attack was still to come in Calais, and he kept his reserves in Calais."
The idea that the Nazis should think that the invasion of Normandy was a diversion even after it had been launched was actually something scrupulously orchestrated by the Allies. Garcia had a part in this too. He was supposed to send a message effectively alerting the Nazis that the invasion was happening, but this was just bait.
One of the points of Operation Fortitude was to keep the Germans guessing so that any real invasion might appear to be a mere diversion. The plan was to send a second message a few days later after D-Day, saying that a larger invasion was coming. This would make the Germans pull back their reserves, giving Allies valuable time to gain ground in Normandy. However, on D-Day, something unexpected happened. The Germans weren't listening. In fact, they didn't respond to Garcia until 8 a.m., 2 hours after the landings began. Always in character, Garcia knew what to do. He wrote back in great outrage at the Nazis' carelessness and actually made them apologize to him.
In the end, the Nazis were fooled so completely by Garcia, a month after D-Day, they awarded him the Iron Cross. Ironically, that November, Garcia was also awarded the Order of the British Empire, one of the highest English awards. Both of these awards made it, so he was the only person to obtain high honors from both sides of World War II.
Garcia's importance to the entire operation is highlighted in an NPR interview with Stefan Talty, author of the book Agent Garbo, the brilliant, eccentric, secret agent who tricked Hitler and saved D-Day. As he said, and I quote, "Pujol was the point of the spear in getting that information across to Hitler," end quote. There were fake destroyers being created out of rubber, fake airfields cut into the English countryside where real planes had landed. Garcia was sort of the screenwriter for an epic film that was being played out right across England.
After the end of World War II, Garcia continued to work for M15. His job was to investigate whether the remnants of the Nazi regime had plans to resurrect a Fourth Reich in Germany. After this mission was over, Garcia recognized it would be best to leave Europe, both for his mental health and due to the fact that if found out he would be a huge target for anyone who remained loyal to the Third Reich. Due to this, he moved to Venezuela. Ironically, an area many prior high-ranking Nazi officers also moved to in a bid to escape justice for their crimes against humanity. Because of this, Garcia decided he wanted to fake his death.
Upon this decision, he called his old handler, Tomas Harris, in 1948 and arranged for the idea that he had died of malaria in Angola to be spread through the M15 and to the outer world. Eventually, Garcia's wife and children, who had moved back to Spain from originally accompanying him to Venezuela, were alerted of his death. During this time, Garcia was living a fairly normal life in Venezuela, having donned a distinctive pair of glasses and a fluffy beard as a disguise.
Garcia only came out of hiding in the 1980s when Nigel West, a British writer, began studying his adventures and formed a theory he was not in fact dead. West proved this by tracking down Garcia, who then, convinced, came out of hiding, reconnecting with both his wife, who had always believed he was probably alive somewhere, and his kids, who unfortunately had not.
Garcia finally died in 1988 in Coroni, Venezuela, leading to his high-stake life story that ended with a peaceful finish. Now, let's go back a few steps and talk about Garcia's wife.
It is not uncommon for women to be left out of history, and Garcia's wife is no exception. Throughout his time working against the Nazis, his wife, Araceli González de Pujol, was constantly involved. In fact, she had worked once to convince her husband's German handlers that he was on a mission in England while he stayed in Portugal, and she herself delivered some of his first spy messages. She also contributed to the stories of the 28 imaginary spies that Garcia had created. However, her involvement was cut short once Garcia was officially accepted as a spy for the British. This, along with having to uproot her whole life to bring the family, which included the couple's young son, to England, caused her declining support for Garcia once moving.
In fact, his wife was quite unhappy about having to move to London, where she had no friends, no family, and barely spoke the language. She wasn't even allowed to contact other Spaniards, who were her friends, in England, due to her husband's work with the M15. All of this resulted in her life being extremely unpleasant, all because of her husband's job.
Yeah, she really didn't seem fond of London, and England in general. In fact, History.com quotes her as speaking of English food as, "Too much macaroni, too much potatoes, not enough fish."
She so much didn't like her life in England that she even threatened to expose her husband's operations and the operations of the M15 agents of the time.
This, of course, caused a massive backlash and even had Garcia turn his acting prowess against her, resulting in a quite upsetting string of events.
Garcia employed the use of the M15 to convince his wife that he had been imprisoned after becoming violent upon being fired from service due to his wife's actions. After having this reported to her, she called an M15 agent to her home, where he found her with all of the gas taps turned on, threatening to commit suicide. The M15 agent didn't care, believing this was most likely a ploy to expose the fact that her husband was faking his detention. Araceli was then brought to an M15 interrogation center where she was allowed to meet with her husband, who was dressed as a prisoner. Upon seeing this, she signed an apology and promised to never do anything to jeopardize Garcia's work in the future.
After the war, Garcia's wife initially moved with him to Venezuela, where he hid from retaliation for his spying for several years. However, she moved back to Spain in 1948 with her 3 children, unable to save their failing marriage. She was later informed of his fake death by M15, after which she remarried.
The title, The Master of Deception, would not be misplaced if awarded to Garcia for all of his efforts. While it was unlikely, he was one of the many heroes that emerged from the aftermath of terrible events. Thank you for listening to the OWL Podcast. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Liberty.
And we'll see you next time.